This episode is brought to you by Microsoft Azure. Turn your ideas into reality with an Azure free account. Get everything you need to develop apps across cloud and hybrid environments, scale workloads, create cloud-connected mobile experiences, and so much more. Discover what you can create with popular services free for 12 months. Learn more at azure.com. That's azure.com. And sign up for a free account to start building in the cloud today.
Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, Nigel Farage and the far-right Southport shame in the aftermath of the tragic killing of 3 children in the Merseyside seaside town, and our hearts go out to all of those affected by their deaths. A local mosque was besieged by a group of thugs who set fire to police vans and injured 50 officers. Numerous far-right agitators fanned the flames on social media, suggesting that the girls died as a result of an attack by an Islamist or an undocumented migrant, or that it was in some way motivated by anti-white sentiment. Reform Party leader Nigel Farage posted a video before it all kicked off, questioning why the incident was not being treated as terror-related and asking whether the truth is being withheld from us. Brendan Cox, the husband of murdered MP Joe Cox, accused him of inciting a riot and dubbed him Tommy Robinson in a suit. We're joined by Joe Mulhall. Joe is the Director of Research at Hope Not Hate, the anti-fascist organisation, and Dr Bethany Usher, author of Journalism and Crime and a senior lecturer in journalism at Newcastle University. Joe, I want to talk with you. You've been monitoring the timeline of social media and then the subsequent riots that erupted. Just talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, as increasingly seems to be the case these days, within a matter of moments and certainly within hours of the tragic news breaking that this awful attack had happened, we started to pick up far-right individuals and people on the extreme fringe organising and starting to spread misinformation. I mean, by 6 p.m. on Monday evening, in fact, there was groups being set up that were starting to spread mis and disinformation. And then over the following 24 hours, we saw a range of quite high-profile far-right figures. I mean, you've mentioned Nigel Farage's contribution, which was pretty shocking, and I'm sure we'll talk about, but also figures such as Tommy Robinson or people within his orbit, but also people like Andrew Tate, the famous misogynist, who released a video which got viewed millions of times, claiming that the attacker was an undocumented migrant who'd crossed the channel in a boat. And we started to see huge levels of anger and huge levels of engagement of this misinformation and disinformation that was spreading around far-right circles.
And we should be clear here, Joe, that at the time that we are speaking, the police have a suspect, a 17-year-old who we understand had lived in Cardiff for much of his life and had then moved to Southport. But that person is only a suspect. Their name has not been put into the public domain by the police, although some people have put a name out there via social media, and they have not yet been convicted of any offence. So we simply do not know why anybody committed this atrocity. The only certainty is that an horrific crime was committed, but why and exactly who by, we do not know.
The police have released information that says that the attacker was born in Cardiff to Rwandan parents, but was actually born here in the UK. But they've also put out information saying that they have no evidence that there is an Islamist motivation behind the crime. And I think a couple of things happen when these sorts of horrifying events happen. There are those individuals that are predisposed to prejudice and discrimination, that are already either kind of inculcated with far-right ideas or are active far-right individuals. And the moment that a horrific event like this happens, there is a presumption on their part that it must be a Muslim, that it must be a person of colour, that it must be an asylum seeker. So there's those people there which instantly just leaped in with presumptions based on their own prejudices. And then there was also those people that consciously, and I think extraordinarily shamefully, considering how horrible the attack was, saw it as an opportunity. They saw this horrifying event had happened and they saw it as an opportunity to whip up local anger. I mean, understandably, the people in those communities, in fact, all over the country, are furious about what's happened. There's fear and anger. And some people on the far right saw it as an opportunity to spread misinformation, disinformation, and essentially to try and target that anger that exists towards Muslims, towards asylum seekers, towards people of color, and to try and advance their narrative that, multiculturalism has collapsed and that we're living in a kind of post-apocalyptic hellscape. And I think it's that use of a tragedy like this which is so disgusting. Most people were still shocked and heartbroken. There was some on the far right that felt that this was their chance.
Absolutely. And it was a shocking and horrific attack, and how anyone would seek to make capital out of the human suffering that has happened in Southport is, for me, beyond belief. And Bethany, what Joe is talking about fits into a bigger story, doesn't it, that you have written about the othering of minorities, particularly, but not exclusively, Muslims, but the othering of refugees, those who have sought sanctuary in Britain by crossing the Channel. And that has been a mainstream narrative. That has been a narrative that has been sustained in newspapers like the Daily Mail, in newspapers like the Telegraph, and it's a narrative that has been sustained at the very top of our government for many years before the incoming Labour government.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And there's some other dimensions to this around representation and representational cultures, but also around the growing use of crime as clickbait, particularly violent crime, and sensational crime, and how that has both political, commercial, and social implications. Because one of the reasons that people like Tommy Robinson or Andrew Tate produce content is because it gets click, it gains them attention, and we live in an attention economy for them. So it's not just politically motivated, it's also about money too. And the website, the fake news site, a chat called Channel 3 News, which pretends to be an American site, it's actually hosted in Pakistan, is a site that draws through AI and through algorithms content that is being circulated online for commercial gain, creates clickbait. So it wasn't just about creating this toxic political environment. It was about using this tragedy to make money, using the deaths of these children to make money. And that's equally as abhorrent and something that we're not talking about enough. And what we have to look at as a society, I think, and all social media users, is we're living in a time where it doesn't look likely that the social media companies are going to do very much about these things. They're not addressing the problems with algorithms or hate preachers, misogynist hate preachers like Andrew Tate, Islamophobic hate preachers like Tommy Robinson, and other kinds of hate preachers are able to continue spewing their bile. So as users, what's our responsibility? And one of the problems here is lots of people mindlessly shared that content on. They didn't think, they didn't stop, they didn't think of the consequences, and Southport as a community is suffering from that today.
And it has been one of the encouraging things that the people of Southport themselves, who had this mob descend upon them from outside, have collectively sought to repudiate the idea that there is anything dangerous or threatening about their mosque. People of all backgrounds have come together to try and help restore the mosque, to replace some of the damaged property and so on. This is something that has been visited upon Southport from people outside.
Yes, absolutely. And not just outside in terms of geographic sense, but also from outside in terms of a media sense. And what I mean by that is there's a very different relationship with local journalists, with people who might be working in the community, and how they would use social media and how they would report on it, and the kind of hit and run content that we've seen here. And I talk in my book about issues of hypercriminality and how digital content can fuel crime, can fuel copycats. It's often happened in the times of riots, where people see riots unfolding and kind of join in, and it escalates in that way. But also, and vice versa, how crime can fuel digital content, how this loop of hypercriminality. And we've really got to kind of take a step back here and think about the consequences.
Joe, I was talking about that broader political context, because that context isn't just owned by the far right, or at least not by the traditional far right. It has been owned, sadly, by some members of the governing Conservative Party, including Home Secretaries like Suella Braverman.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. I think sometimes, and this isn't something new, this can go back to the Notting Hill riots in 1958 and beyond, when moments like this happen, it's sometimes comforting to think of it as this is like a group of far-right activists that have come from somewhere else and turned up and done this thing. We have to look at the rioting that happened in the context of widespread societal Islamophobia and anti-Muslim prejudice and say, well, where is this coming from? In some senses, what the far right do is they create some prejudice and discrimination, but they actually shape existing prejudice and discrimination. More people have ended up with negative attitudes about Muslims because of what they've read in newspapers and what they've heard from mainstream politicians than what Tommy Robinson has managed. But he manages to maybe shape and direct that anger. And I think sometimes it's comforting to think of the far right as this kind of tumor which hangs off the body politic. And if we just lopped it off, everything else would be fine. But it's not. It's much more of a gangrenous limb that is part of the system. And as you say, we have now come off the back of many years of a conservative government where the rhetoric and the way they talked about Muslims and asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants of all kinds was pernicious, it was negative, it was discriminatory. And it has normalized a lot of that rhetoric. And in some senses, that rhetoric is indistinguishable from the rhetoric that we hear from European radical right parties, but partly because of our electoral system, we didn't have this other force. And that's obviously starting to change a little bit with reform in the last election. I think we need to look at what's happened this week and put it in the context of the fact that on last Saturday in London, there was a far-right demonstration organised by Tommy Robinson that had over 20,000 people on it. And just a few weeks ago, we had a general election where 14% of the vote and 4 million voters voted for reform with a leader that's like Nigel Farage, who contributed to the events last night. There is a climate of anti-Muslim prejudice and anti-asylum seeker and anti-migrant prejudice across society. And we need to be doing more. And one of the challenges for the new Labour government is for years we've neglected discussions about cohesion and multiculturalism, etc. These things have to be fought for and worked on. And actually, we've come off the back of a 14 years or many, many years of a conservative government that have not only not worked on these issues, they've made them exponentially worse. And I think what we're seeing here in some sense is a symptom as much as anything else.
Yeah, and adding to that mix, I just want to specifically mention Boris Johnson with his reference to Muslim women wearing niqabs as letterboxes, a dehumanizing reference. I want to talk to you, Joe, specifically about Nigel Farage, though. On this podcast before, I've described him as perhaps the most influential politician of our generation. And I say that without any great acclaim, but just as a realistic recognition of the fact that even when he wasn't an elected representative, he drove the Brexit agenda successfully. And of course, he isn't the only person with a responsibility here, but it struck me that his comments when Merseyside police were saying that they did not believe this was an Islamist-inspired attack, which remains their stance, he puts out a video, bearing in mind he's an MP, suggesting that the truth might be being withheld from us. What do you make of that?
It's hard to almost say with Nigel Farage to say, it's shocking. But actually, in this case, I think it really, truly was really quite disturbing. And there's a few parts to it. Firstly, as you say, he's now an MP. If he actually wanted answers to those questions that he was positing, there was ways for him to get answers to those questions. Of course, he chose not to do that. He chose not to go to the House and ask a question, for example. He chose to put out a social media video. And I think that shows the real motivations behind what he actually did yesterday. It was in one sense quite cowardly. He didn't come out and say, I think this, I think that. He couched it in this get out clause, which was by asking questions, but he knew it would have the same effect. And I think that's a recognition that he's ostensibly trying to tread this line where by now he's an MP, Reform won 4 million votes. They are looking towards more mainstream respectability, but he also has one eye on 25,000 people in Trafalgar Square last weekend with Tommy Robinson, many of whom were making direct claims and calls to Farage to support them and saying, we are your constituency. It's the worst form of dog whistle politics. He knows that he can raise questions. And when he says, we don't know if this person was on a watch list, despite the fact the police had said it wasn't Islamist inspired, he is saying, we don't know if this person is Muslim. Would be my reading of what he's saying there. And so, of course, it's deeply irresponsible. I think the fact that he's in Parliament and, of course, he was the way he was questioning the official narrative is really deeply dangerous. And it was many ways the perfect example of Farage. There was a nod and a wink to the far right. He was careful to make sure that he didn't say anything that could be too misconstrued, but he knew what he was doing. And I think it's really, really scary to see this man is now sitting in Parliament.
I think the thing is as well with Farage and the kind of digital dog whistling that he's brought into the 3-year-old, how successfully he has used the kind of digital dog whistle, is that it feeds into the narratives you were talking about, the mainstream press, in very clever ways. So if you look at the relationships between the Mail Online and some of the things that Farage has said and how they treat him, he's given this kind of soft soak celebrity treatment in some ways during a campaign. Look at him taking selfies, look at him doing it, and at the same time, both are pushing this political agenda, and this relationship between dynamics of kind of soft celebrity politics and the far right are kind of expanding everywhere at the moment with really dangerous implications. But I think also something else that was really dangerous that happened was there was a MMA fighter, Andrew Fowler, who posted a video initially saying it was a Syrian refugee as part of this early kind of movement to say it was a Muslim refugee who was responsible for this. And then underneath, people said that this young person was British, born, we think, to Rwandan parents. That isn't confirmed as yet, I have to say. What is confirmed is that he's born in Cardiff and that there is no link from the police. So far, there is no link to Islam. There is no, kind of no suggestion of that. And so people were putting it underneath, and he kind of didn't change the video, just dismissed that and, oh, well, Rwandan then, still an immigrant. Well, no, he's British born. So what does that mean now? Are we saying that all black born Brits, just quickly, casually like that, are not British? That, that if they're the children of immigrants, well, that would include our former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. That would include Kami Badenoch, who might be the next Conservative leader. It was so casually done. And it's everywhere today if you look at that kind of link. Well, it's just the same then it's just the same as him being a Muslim if he happens to be Rwandan. And I think that this is a really, really dangerous time.
In preparing this podcast, I did think about bringing in some kind of reference to Kristallnacht, the occasion when Jewish businesses across Germany were attacked by the Nazis in 1933, which many people regarded as the signal for the start of full-on Nazism in Germany. And I pulled back from that because I thought that is perhaps too extreme, but I still am drawn to that reference. And I say this as the son of someone who was a German Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, someone whose grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. I'm not saying that this was Kristallnacht, but the othering of a minority, the mob mentality that goes after that minority on zero evidence, that tells me that Nazism, the spirit of Nazism, is sadly alive on the streets of Britain.
I get nervous around parallels with the 1930s, etc., because, of course, the extent and the extremeness in some senses make it very, very hard to draw parallels. One thing of the lessons I think we can learn is where even if we don't need to make the direct comparison to, say, Kristallnacht, is the speed with which things can get terrible, the speed with which things can go from growing discrimination and prejudice across society, and the speed with which that can be weaponized and it can end up in terribly dark places. And we don't just need to, we can make parallels with a range of genocides subsequently as well, right through Rwanda, Cambodia, Darfur, etc. These things can happen very, very quickly. And I think if there is a lesson, the lesson is to guard against any form of complacency. One of the real dangers, I think, is the speed with which this sort of stuff becomes normalized. The speed with which it became normalized that Reform would get 4 million votes and have MPs. The speed with which we've seen that across, the French elections recently, for example, people were relieved and celebrating them, despite the fact that the Le Pen's results were incomprehensible or unconscionable just a decade and a half ago. The speed with which this sort of stuff normalized is really scary. And what happened last night was a mob turned up outside a mosque and chanted, "Burn the mosque." We have to continue to make sure that people find that as appalling as they currently do right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the speed of all of this is something that I keep coming back to, the speed with which the organisation happened, but the speed with which this false narrative grew and transformed and changed and became until that when the elements of the real truth started feeding into it, the kind of false narrative framed it. It framed the facts. in a way that was disinformation in its own right. And I think it's incredibly dangerous for our understanding of society and an understanding of our neighbours. But I do also think that with organisation, and I hope that we do need to address, I think, some of the hate preachers with greater focus around misogyny, around Islamophobia, and, start criminalising them, and, like we do other forms of hate speech in this country, that we can fight back against this growing malaise. And I am hopeful that this may have given some people a shock, where they would step back from the things they shared without thought and think, I don't want this. This is not who we are.
I agree. And I think there was a vigil yesterday that saw thousands of local people coming together. And we saw a lot of the good bits there. We saw people sharing in that pain, and we saw people showing love and caring. We've seen people cleaning up the streets, as you say. It's always worth remembering that these people are a minority, the sorts of people that engage in this sort of hateful behaviour and awful, inexcusable, but they remain a minority. The good news there is that the only way these people win is if we don't decide to stand up and fight them, if we don't decide to push back. And there's nothing inevitable to this rise that we're talking about, to this rising far right, this rising hatred. There's nothing inevitable to it. We are still in the majority here by quite some margin. So the hopeful bit is that if we do stand up and we do decide to oppose these people, we win. It's just making sure that we actually get round to it and get stuck in straight away.
Joe, thank you for your time. Joe Mulhall, the Director of Research at Hope Not Hate. Thanks also to Dr Bethany Usher, author of Journalism and Crime and a senior lecturer in journalism at Newcastle University. I'm Adrian Goldberg. You've been listening to the Byline podcast. And just to remind you as well, we've got some fantastic podcast offerings over at bylineaudio.com, including the very funny, myth-busting Utter Bollocks with Otto English and John Mitchinson. Head over to bylineaudio.com to see exactly what we've got to offer, including a premium content offering, which gives you extra audio that you can't get anywhere else, including an ad-free version of this podcast for a small fee, of course. Anyway, more details over at bylineaudio.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline.